Okay, this is my lecture on moral panics, media representation, and public reaction to manufactured fears. And so, Stanley Cohen was one who really wrote the book on moral panics, which was very important in the sociology of crime, deviance, and transgression. So, moral panics refers to this to the collective societal reaction to a perceived threat or a deviance that is often exaggerated and disproportionate to the actual threat that's posed. These panics are typically fueled by media coverage and amplified by various social actors. This could include politicians, religious leaders, community activists, who make this call for action against this perceived threat or this perceived deviance. So some key concepts in moral panics is the idea of deviance. And remember, as I've said, deviance and even crime for that matter is not a quality inherent in any given action, but a quality bestowed upon an action. In other words, it's an interpretation of an action, usually by outsiders. And so, but in general, deviance refers to behaviors, actions, or individuals that violate established social norms, values, or laws. Stealing, murder, engaging in illegal drugs, these are all considered deviant in many societies. Um, there's also, of course, a relativity of deviance. What is considered deviant can vary significantly across different cultures, societies, and historical epochs as well. And there's many examples of that. And so, homosexuality was once considered deviant in many societies until the latter half of the 20th century. But in most Western societies, it's increasingly accepted. So there's many examples like that. And so Stanley Cohen, as I said, was a pivotal figure in the study of moral panics. And it's important to note that he emphasized the reaction to deviance rather than the deviance itself. And I think that was kind of a new twist, new understanding of crime and deviance in society, how society responds to perceived threats. And he argued that the focus should not be on why people engage in deviant behavior, but rather how society reacts to those behaviors and the consequences to those reactions. Moral panic, to give a definition, it's an exaggerated, often irrational societal reaction to a perceived threat or deviance that challenges norms, social norms, values, orthodoxy, or the status quo. One example, something I've written about before, is the satanic panic of the 1980s, where mostly in the United States, where people feared the widespread satanic ritual abuse in many American cities. There was no evidence of that really, but nonetheless, it was a moral panic that there were satanic teachings in the high schools and the colleges. Just like there's this view that there's this radical Marxist, anti-American teachings in the university. No evidence of that really, but nonetheless, it was a panic. So some of the core characteristics of moral panics: one, there's a heightened concern, a surge in public fear, a concern regarding a particular deviant behavior or a deviant group that is seen as a threat to societal order. It could be many examples: widespread anxiety to video game violence in the 1990s. Today, obviously, you can talk about immigration and the dangers posed by immigration, or the threats of terror, or things of that nature. So heightened concern. Two, so one is heightened concern. Two, hostility. The group or individuals associated with the deviant behavior are demonized and often scapegoated for larger social problems. These groups become folk devils. The scapegoated people are the folk devils. And they become symbolic of everything that is wrong in society. With the study of youth-resistant subcultures in the 1960s, the mods and the rockers, of the UK, they became, folk devils. I guess another obvious example today would be immigrants being blamed for societal problems, and so they become the new folk devils of the day. And there's always folk devils going on in society, the folk devils that are created. Okay, so one is heightened concern, two is hostility, three, consensus. There's a broad consensus develops that the threat is real, that it's dangerous, and that it's widespread, even though the evidence might not even really exist or might be minimal or exaggerated. Um, I guess an example that could be video games causing violence in children, despite studies showing no direct correlation or, certainly no causation. 4, disproportionality. The societal response to the perceived threat is out of proportion to the actual threat or harm that's caused. I guess one example could be the panic surrounding marijuana use in the early 20th century that led to strict anti-drug laws, despite minimal evidence of harm. We can even use other drugs as examples of that as well. In fact, the entire the war on drugs was basically a moral panic, and it happened during a time when there was really no problem with drugs. So they made it up, the war on drugs. They made up the danger. They made up the threat. Nancy Reagan's just say no to drugs, and so, but yet a lot of our brothers and sisters are sitting in prisons right now due to engaging in behaviors that were there was no violence and no real threat to the social order. 5, volatility. Moral panics are often short-lived. They rise and they fall rapidly as public attention drifts or shifts to new concerns. The immigrants to the Russians to the Koreans to the people in the Middle East to what Hillary Clinton called the super predators. She used that term to refer to young, mostly black men in the inner city. So this volatility, moral panics, like I said, short-lived, rise, fall rapidly as public attention shifts into new concerns, and so there's many examples of that. And then you have the folk devils. Definition of folk devils are individuals or groups of people who are scapegoated and blamed for larger societal problems that are structural problems. This happens during the moral panic. They become symbolic representations of social decay or a threat to societal values. In other words, they're what's wrong. If we can just fix this group, then we'd be okay. And so, if we can just stop immigration, then America will be great again. So there's an example of the new folk devil. And then with these folk devils, they become demonized and dehumanized as well. So both demonized and dehumanized. Folk devils are often depicted as morally corrupt or dangerous. As Trump said, there are some bad hombres, leading to a heightened societal reaction and a demand for action, sometimes resulting in legal changes or moral crusades. It's important to note that once people become demonized or they become dehumanized, you can drop bombs on them, you can kill them, you can put them in cages, you can deport them, you can violate their human rights, you can do awful things to them, and it becomes justified. In fact, before the United States goes to any war, there's usually years and sometimes decades of dehumanizing people. So when we drop bombs and kill them and their babies, well, it's because they're awful people. They hate Americans. They're not really human. They're animals. They deserve to die, or they need to die. And so you can see plenty of examples of that, of people that have been demonized and dehumanized, and as a result, they've lost their human rights, and oftentimes they're even their right to exist. I think, of course, immigrant populations would be a good example of that today. And then you have moral entrepreneurs. These are people, individuals, oftentimes attached to institutions, like the media, politicians, religious leaders, or groups like, MAD, Mothers Against Drinking and Driving, that actively seek to influence public opinion by highlighting certain deviant behaviors and advocating for some type of moral or legal change. Example of this is going back to satanic panic, maybe the media playing a pivotal role in creating this satanic panic that never existed. Well, the satanic panic existed, but not Satanism, by broadcasting unverified stories of satanic rituals. Kids are 666 signs and sacrificing animals and doing drugs and sacrificing people and things like that things of that nature. And so the moral entrepreneurs play a very crucial or critical role in moral panics. They are the ones that create and perpetuate moral panics by raising alarm about the perceived threat, again, usually without evidence, and lobbying for some type of social or legal reforms. like politicians calling for stricter drug laws during the war on drugs, despite evidence that drug use was not significantly higher than before. There's also a process to moral panics that evolve in several stages. So I think it's important to understand some of those stages. One, stage one, a deviant act or event occurs. It's a trigger event. A deviant act or event takes place, often a violent or shocking incident that captures public attention. For one example would be the post-World War II British youth subcultures, the mods and the rockers, their clashes in the 1960s, where youth subcultures, they got in fights and they were seen as portrayed as violent and all about youth rebellion, kids gone wild, and this made media headlines. Stage two is media amplification. Media sensationalism. The media plays an important role in amplifying the deviant act, exaggerating the severity and the frequency of the issue. This coverage can frame the act as part of a larger social problem. Again, we can go back to something like the Satanic Panic, baseless rumors about ritual abuse, help create the narrative of an underground satanic conspiracy, or the McCarthyism would be a good example, and the threat of communism. And communists were everywhere. They infiltrated our schools. The communists infiltrated our media. They're in our universities, and they're trying to undermine America and American values. So that's this media sensationalism. And this leads to distortion. The media distorts facts, focusing on the most shocking or sensational elements while neglecting the present or a more balanced view. Like the fear that video games were directly linked to violence was fueled by media sensationalism. There's no evidence, no real scientific evidence for any of this. Stage three is the creation of the folk devils, the scapegoated. The individuals or groups connected to the deviant act are portrayed as the cause of the problem. The folk devils are, again, labeled as morally corrupt, dangerous to society and to social norms. And so, Satanists were, involved in daycare centers, and children entertainers were accused of being part of these satanic cults. Stage four is public outcry in moral entrepreneurs. So public demand for action as moral panics begin to spread. Moral entrepreneurs like the media, politicians, religious groups, some type of community activists or something. They stoke public fear, creating a sense of urgency. This problem needs to be dealt with right now. So political leaders need to demand tougher laws on immigration right now because they're undermining America and destroying democracy, and they're a threat to us. Even though a lot of these fears are unfounded, that immigrants pose a negative threat to society. Stage five, government or law enforcement response, policy and legal changes in response to moral panics. Authorities, police, law enforcement, whatever, they often enact laws, or not police, they don't make laws, but Congress, senators, people in Congress, they often enact laws or policies designed to combat this perceived threat, and the measures can often be overly harsh and repressive, and they'll sic the police on them. So the war on drugs, for example, the war on drugs had led to mass incarceration. The United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. So the United States, more than any other country in the world, locks its citizens, its brothers and sisters, in cages of torture and despair, more than any other country in the world. And so this war on drugs that was manufactured and made up led to mass incarceration. And these policies, of course, disproportionately impacted marginalized communities, especially. Stage six is the decline and diffusion of the panic. Eventually, the moral panics lose public attention. People get bored of it. New issues emerge. The original threat is reinterpreted or simply forgotten, and it goes away. Yet people are still stigmatized, that were scapegoated, and still imprisoned for it. So it goes away for the larger society, but not the ones that were folk devils and scapegoated. And some good examples of moral panics was when British youth subcultural theorists were writing about the mods and the rockers. These were youth subcultures. They clashed on the beaches in England, getting in fights, youth gone wild, media hysteria. Mods and rockers are, out of control group threatening public order. The police crack down on these youth subculture, arresting them, putting them in jail. and the image of youth subcultures persisted in public discourse. Youth are a problem. Um, Other examples, I've already said satanic panic, video games and youth violence, immigration, the threat of communism, the threat of, Arabic people from the Middle East, all of these, during coronavirus, Asian cultures and things like that, all these are examples of moral panics. And so just some theoretical insights on moral panics. It's all about social control, reasserting the norms of the status quo, the dominant culture. Moral panics are a mechanism for reaffirming social boundaries by labeling some behaviors or groups as deviant and then kind of reinforcing the moral social order. Reinforcement of boundaries, creating deviance by labeling groups as deviant. Societies define what is acceptable and marginalize those who do not conform. They stigmatize, label, and marginalize those who don't conform to the dominant culture. So you become a social pariah. Power dynamics, the moral entrepreneurs in control, often those who benefit from moral panics are in positions of power and privilege, and they use moral panics for their own careerism, to get ahead, and to exploit. And they also use moral panics to justify social policies that serve their interests, even though they screw others and scapegoat others, especially the most vulnerable. So, for example, politicians always use moral panics. Certainly the Democrats and Republicans used crime and the war on drugs as a moral panic to win votes. The Democrats and Republicans, even today, they use immigration, to win votes and push through repressive laws that disproportionately affect marginalized groups, bolstering their own political power. So something that you can think about now is what moral panics do you think were most impactful in history? Japanese internment camps. There's all kinds of examples. What moral panics do you think are going on today that disproportionately impact so many people? Okay, so a lot to think about. This stuff is very real and happening before our eyes. We can see these moral panics. Thank you very much.